Welcome back. I was out shopping a bit, charging my camcorder and uploading. It's soon 2 p.m. So let's read one more. I have some biscuits. Let's read one more. Then I will watch Star Trek.
Tank. For other uses, see tank. Disambiguation. A tank is an armored fighting vehicle intended as a primary offensive weapon in frontline ground combat. Tank designs are a balance of heavy firepower, strong armor, and battlefield mobility provided by tracks and a powerful engine. Their main armament is often mounted within a turret. They are a mainstay of modern 20th and 21st century ground forces and a key part of combined arms combat. Modern tanks are versatile mobile land weapons platforms whose main armament is a large caliber tank gun mounted in a rotating gun turret, supplemented by machine guns or other ranged weapons such as anti-tank guided missiles or rocket launchers. They have heavy vehicle armor which provides protection for the crew, the vehicle's munition storage, fuel tank and propulsion systems. The use of tracks rather than wheels provides improved operational mobility which allows the tank to overcome rugged terrain and adverse conditions such as mud and ice forward/snow better than wheeled vehicles, and thus be more flexibly positioned at advantageous locations on the battlefield. These features enable the tank to perform in a variety of intense combat situations, simultaneously both offensively, with direct fire from their powerful main gun, and defensively, as fire support and defilade for friendly troops due to the near invulnerability to common infantry small arms and good resistance against heavier weapons. Although anti-tank weapons used in 2022, some of them man-portable, have demonstrated the ability to destroy older generations of tanks with single shots, all while maintaining the mobility needed to exploit changing tactical situations. Fully integrating tanks into modern military forces spawned a new era of combat, armored warfare. Until the invention of the main battle tank, tanks were typically categorized either by weight class, light, medium, heavy or super heavy tanks, or doctrinal purpose, breakthrough, cavalry, infantry, cruiser, or reconnaissance tanks. Some are larger and more thickly armored and with large guns, while others are smaller, lightly armored, and equipped with a smaller caliber and lighter gun. These smaller tanks move over terrain with speed and agility and can perform a reconnaissance role in addition to engaging hostile targets. The smaller, faster tank would not normally engage in battle with a larger, heavily armored tank, except during a surprise flanking maneuver. Etymology. The word tank was first applied in a military context to British landships in 1915 to keep their nature secret before they entered service. Origins. On the 24th of December, 1915, a meeting took place of the Interdepartmental Conference, including representatives of the Director of Naval Constructions Committee, the Admiralty, the Ministry of Munitions, and the War Office. Its purpose was to discuss the progress of the plans for what were described as Caterpillar machine gun destroyers or land cruisers. In his autobiography, Albert Gerald Stern, Secretary to the Landship Committee, later head of the Mechanical Warfare Supply Department, says that at that meeting, Mr. Thomas J. McNamara, MP, and Parliamentary and Financial Secretary to the Admiralty, then suggested, for secrecy's sake, to change the title of the Landship Committee. Mr. d'Eyncourt agreed that it was very desirable to retain secrecy by all means, and proposed to refer to the vessel as a water carrier. In government offices, committees and departments are always known by their initials. For this reason I, as secretary, considered the proposed title totally unsuitable. In our search for a synonymous term, we changed the word water carrier to tank and became the Tank Supply or TS Committee. That is how these weapons came to be called tanks. He incorrectly added, and the name has now been adopted by all countries in the world. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, who was secretary to the meeting, says that he was instructed to find a non-committal word when writing his report of the proceedings. In the evening he discussed it with a fellow officer, Lt. Col. Walter Daly Jones, and they chose the word tank. That night, in the draft report of the conference, the word tank was employed in its new sense for the first time. Swinton's notes on the employment of tanks, in which he uses the word throughout, was published in January 1916. In July 1918, Popular Science Monthly reported, because a fellow of the Royal Historical Society * has unintentionally misled the British public as to the origin of the famous tanks, Sir William Triton, who designed and built them, has published the real story of their name. Since it was obviously inadvisable to herald Little Willie's reason for existence to the world, he was known as the Instructional Demonstration Unit. Little Willie's hull was called in the shop orders a water carrier for Mesopotamia. No one knew that the hull was intended to be mounted on a truck. Naturally, the water carrier began to be called a tank. So the name came to be used by managers and foremen of the shop. Until now it has a place in the Army vocabulary and will probably be so known in history for all time. *F.J. Gardner, F.R.Hist.S. D'Eyncourt's account differs from Swinton's and Triton's. When the future arrangements were under discussion for transporting the first land ships to France, a question arose as to how, from a security point of view, the consignment should be labeled. To justify their size, we decided to call them water carriers for Russia, the idea being that they should be taken for some new method of taking water to forward troops in the battle areas. Lt. Col. Swinton raised a humorous objection to this, remarking that the War Office pundits would probably contract the description to W.CS for Russia, and that we had better forestall this by merely labeling the packages tanks. So tanks they became, and tanks they have remained. This appears to be an imperfect recollection. He says that the name problem arose when we shipped the first 2 vehicles to France the following year, August 1916, but by that time the name tank had been in use for 8 months. The tanks were labeled with care to Petrograd, but the belief was encouraged that they were a type of snowplow. International. This section possibly contains original research. Please improve it by verifying the claims made and adding inline citations. Statements consisting only of original research should be removed. May 2024, learn how and when to remove this message. The term tank is used throughout the English-speaking world, but other countries use different terminology. In France, the second country to use tanks in battle, the word tank or tank was adopted initially, but was then, largely at the insistence of Colonel J.B.E.S.D.N., rejected in favor of char d'assaut, assault vehicle, or simply char vehicle. During World War I, German sources tended to refer to British tanks as tanks and to their owners Kampfwagen. Later, tanks became referred to as Panzer, lit. Armor, a shortened form of the full term Panzerkampfwagen, literally armored fighting vehicle. In the Arab world, tanks are called daerba, after a type of siege engine. In Italian, a tank is a carro armato, lit. Armed wagon, without reference to its armor. Norway uses the term stridsvagn and Sweden the similar stridsvagn, lit. Battle wagon, also used for chariots, whereas Denmark uses kampvogn, lit fight wagon. Finland uses Panzereve or new, armored wagon, although tanki is also used colloquially. The Polish name czołg, derived from verb czołgicy, to crawl, is used, depicting the way of machine's movement and its speed. In Hungarian the tank is called harkoksi, combat wagon, albeit tank is also common. In Japanese, the term sensha, lit. Battle vehicle, is taken from Chinese and used, and this term is likewise borrowed into Korean as jiancha, / more recent Chinese literature uses the English-derived TNK, tank, as opposed to ZHA with grave NCH, battle vehicle, used in earlier days. Development overview. The modern tank is the result of a century of development from the first primitive armored vehicles, due to improvements in technology such as the internal combustion engine, which allowed the rapid movement of heavy armored vehicles. As a result of these advances, tanks underwent tremendous shifts in capability in the years since their first appearance. Tanks in World War I were developed separately and simultaneously by Great Britain and France as a means to break the deadlock of trench warfare on the Western Front. The first British prototype, nicknamed Little Willie, was constructed at William Foster and Company in Lincoln, England in 1915, with leading roles played by Major Walter Gordon Wilson, who designed the gearbox and hull, and by William Tritton of William Foster and Company, who designed the track plates. This was a prototype of a new design that would become the British Army's Mark I tank, the first tank used in combat in September 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. The name tank was adopted by the British during the early stages of their development, as a security measure to conceal their purpose, see etymology. While the British and French built thousands of tanks in World War I, Germany was unconvinced of the tank's potential, and did not have enough resources, thus it built only 20. Tanks of the interwar period evolved into the much larger and more powerful designs of World War II. Important new concepts of armored warfare were developed. The Soviet Union launched the first mass tank forward/air attack at Kharkhingal, Nomonhan, in August 1939, and later developed the T-34, one of the predecessors of the main battle tank. Less than 2 weeks later, Germany began their large-scale armored campaigns that would become known as Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, massed concentrations of tanks combined with motorized and mechanized infantry, artillery and air power designed to break through the enemy front and collapse enemy resistance. The widespread introduction of high-explosive anti-tank warheads during the second half of World War II led to lightweight infantry-carried anti-tank weapons such as the Panzerfaust, which could destroy some types of tanks. Tanks in the Cold War were designed with these weapons in mind, and led to greatly improved armor types during the 1960s, especially composite armor. Improved engines, transmissions and suspensions allowed tanks of this period to grow larger. Aspects of gun technology changed significantly as well, with advances in shell design and aiming technology. During the Cold War, the main battle tank concept arose and became a key component of modern armies. In the 21st century, with the increasing role of asymmetrical warfare and the end of the Cold War, that also contributed to the increase of cost-effective anti-tank rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, worldwide and its successors, the ability of tanks to operate independently has declined. Modern tanks are more frequently organized into combined arms units which involve the support of infantry, who may accompany the tanks in infantry fighting vehicles, and supported by reconnaissance or ground attack aircraft. History. Main article, History of the Tank. Conceptions. The tank is the 20th century realization of an ancient concept, that of providing troops with mobile protection and firepower. The internal combustion engine, armor plate, and continuous track were key innovations leading to the invention of the modern tank. During the 119 BC Battle of Mobi of the Han-Syrian New War, the famous Han general Wei Qing led his army through a fatiguing expeditionary march across the Gobi Desert only to find Yujixi Shinryu's main force waiting to encircle them on the other side. Using armored heavy wagons known as Wugang wagon, Chinese, in ring formations that provided Chinese archers, crossbowmen and infantry protection from the Xiongnu's powerful cavalry charges, and allowed Han troops to utilize their ranged weapons' advantages of precision. This forced a stalemate and allowed time for his troops to recover strength, before using the cover of a sandstorm to launch a counter-offensive which overran the nomads. Model of Leonardo da Vinci's fighting vehicle. Many sources imply that Leonardo da Vinci and H.G. Wells in some way foresaw or invented the tank. Leonardo's late 15th century drawings of what some describe as a tank show a man-powered, wheeled vehicle with cannons all around it. However, the human crew would not have enough power to move it over larger distance, and usage of animals was problematic in a space so confined. In the 15th century, Janica built armored wagons known as Wagenburg containing cannons and used them effectively in several battles during the Hussite Wars. The continuous caterpillar track arose from attempts to improve the mobility of wheeled vehicles by spreading their weight, reducing ground pressure, and increasing their traction. Experiments can be traced back as far as the 17th century, and by the late 19th they existed in various recognizable and practical forms in several countries. It is frequently claimed that Richard Lovell Edgeworth created a caterpillar track. It is true that in 1770 he patented a machine that should carry and lay down its own road, but this was Edgeworth's choice of words. His own account in his autobiography is of a horse-drawn wooden carriage on 8 retractable legs, capable of lifting itself over high walls. The description bears no similarity to a caterpillar track. Armored trains appeared in the mid-19th century, and various armored steam and petrol-engined vehicles were also proposed. The machines described in Wells's 1903 short story The Land Ironclads are a step closer, insofar as they are armor-plated, have an internal power plant, and are able to cross trenches. Some aspects of the story foresee the tactical use and impact of the tanks that later came into being. However, Wells's vehicles were driven by steam and moved on pedrail wheels, technologies that were already outdated at the time of writing. After seeing British tanks in 1916, Wells denied having invented them, writing, "Yet let me state at once that I was not their prime originator. I took up an idea, manipulated it slightly, and handed it on." It is, though, possible that one of the British tank pioneers, Ernest Swinton, was subconsciously or otherwise influenced by Wells's tale. The first combinations of the 3 principal components of the tank appeared in the decade before World War I. In 1903, Captain Léon René Levasseur of the French artillery proposed mounting a field gun in an armored box on tracks. Major William E. Donoghue, of the British Army's Mechanical Transport Committee, suggested fixing a gun and armored shield on a British type of track-driven vehicle. The first armored car was produced in Austria in 1904. However, all were restricted to rails or reasonably passable terrain. It was the development of a practical caterpillar track that provided the necessary independent, all-terrain mobility. In a memorandum of 1908, Antarctic explorer Robert Falcon Scott presented his view that man-hauling to the South Pole was impossible and that motor traction was needed. Snow vehicles did not yet exist, however, and so his engineer Reginald Skelton developed the idea of a caterpillar track for snow surfaces. These tracked motors were built by the Wolseley Tool and Motor Car Company in Birmingham and tested in Switzerland and Norway, and can be seen in action in Herbert Ponting's 1911 documentary film of Scott's Antarctic Terra Nova expedition. Scott died during the expedition in 1912, but expedition member and biographer Apsley Cherry-Garrard credited Scott's motors with the inspiration for the British World War I tanks, writing, "Scott never knew their true possibilities, for they were the direct ancestors of the tanks in France." In 1911, a lieutenant engineer in the Austrian army, Gunther Burstin, presented to the Austrian and Prussian war ministries plans for a light, three-man tank with a gun in a revolving turret, the so-called Burstin-Motorschuss. In the same year, an Australian civil engineer named Lancelot de Mol submitted a basic design for a tracked, armoured vehicle to the British War Office. In Russia, Vasily Mendeleev designed a tracked vehicle containing a large naval gun. All of these ideas were rejected and, by 1914, forgotten, although it was officially acknowledged after the war that de Mol's design was at least the equal to the initial British tanks. Various individuals continued to contemplate the use of tracked vehicles for military applications, but by the outbreak of the war no one in a position of responsibility in any army seems to have given much thought to tanks. World War I. Main article, Tanks in World War I. United Kingdom. The direct military impact of the tank can be debated, but its effect on the Germans was immense. It caused bewilderment, terror and concern in equal measure. It was also a huge boost to the civilians at home. After facing the Zeppelins, at last Britain had a wonder weapon. Tanks were taken on tours and treated almost like film stars. David Willey, curator at the Tank Museum, Bovington. From late 1914, a small number of middle-ranking British Army officers tried to persuade the War Office and the government to consider the creation of armoured vehicles. Amongst their suggestions was the use of Caterpillar tractors, but although the Army used many such vehicles for towing heavy guns, it could not be persuaded that they could be adapted as armoured vehicles. The consequence was that early tank development in the United Kingdom was carried out by the Royal Navy. British World War I Mark V** tank. As the result of an approach by Royal Naval Air Service officers who had been operating armoured cars on the Western Front, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, formed the Landship Committee on the 20th of February 1915. The Director of Naval Construction for the Royal Navy, Eustace Tennyson d'Eyncourt, was appointed to head the committee in view of his experience with the engineering methods it was felt might be required. The two other members were naval officers, and a number of industrialists were engaged as consultants. So many played a part in its long and complicated development that it is not possible to name any individual as the sole inventor of the tank. However, leading roles were played by Lieutenant Walter Gordon Wilson RN, who designed the gearbox and developed practical tracks, and by William Tritton, whose agricultural machinery company, William Foster and Company in Lincoln, Lincolnshire, England, built the prototypes. On the 22nd of July 1915, a commission was placed to design a machine that could cross a trench 4 feet wide. Secrecy surrounded the project, with the designers locking themselves in a room at the White Hart Hotel in Lincoln. The committee's first design, Little Willie, ran for the first time in September 1915 and served to develop the form of the track, but an improved design, better able to cross trenches, swiftly followed, and in January 1916 the prototype, nicknamed Mother, was adopted as the design for future tanks. The first order for tanks was placed on the 12th of February 1916, and a second on the 21st of April. Foster's built 37, all-mail, and Metropolitan Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, of Birmingham, 113, 38 male and 75 female, a total of 150. Production models of male tanks, armed with naval cannon and machine guns, and females, carrying only machine guns, would go on to fight in history's first tank action at the Somme in September 1916. Great Britain produced about 2,600 tanks of various types during the war. The first tank to engage in battle was designated D1, a British Mark I male, during the Battle of Fles-Courcelette, part of the wider Somme offensive, on the 15th of September 1916. Bert Cheney, a 19-year-old signaller with the 7th London Territorial Battalion, reported that 3 huge mechanical monsters such as he had never seen before rumbled their way onto the battlefield, frightening the Jerries out of their wits and making them scuttle like frightened rabbits. When the news of the first use of the tanks emerged, Prime Minister David Lloyd George commented, "It is really to Mr. Winston Churchill that the credit is due more than to anyone else. He took up with enthusiasm the idea of making them a long time ago, and he met with many difficulties. He converted me, and at the Ministry of Munitions he went ahead and made them. The Admiralty experts were invaluable, and gave the greatest possible assistance. They are, of course, experts in the matter of armor plating. Major Stern, formerly an officer in the Royal Naval Air Service, a businessman at the Ministry of Munitions, had charge of the work of getting them built, and he did the task very well. Cole Swinton and others also did valuable work." David Lloyd George, the 19th of September, 1916. France. French Renault foot tanks, here operated by the U.S. Army, pioneered the use of a fully traversable turret and served as pattern for most modern tanks. Whilst several experimental machines were investigated in France, it was a colonel of artillery, J.B. Estienne, who directly approached the commander-in-chief with detailed plans for a tank on Caterpillar tracks, in late 1915. The result was 2 largely unsatisfactory types of tank, 400 each of the Schneider and Saint-Chamond, both based on the Holt tractor. The following year, the French pioneered the use of a full 360 degrees rotation turret in a tank for the first time, with the creation of the Renault Foot-Light tank, with the turret containing the tank's main armament. In addition to the traversable turret, another innovative feature of the Foot was its engine located at the rear. This pattern, with the gun located in a mounted turret and the engine at the back, has become the standard for most succeeding tanks across the world even to this day. The Foot was the most numerous tank of the war, over 3,000 were made by late 1918. Germany. Germany fielded very few tanks during World War I, and started development only after encountering British tanks on the Somme. The A7V, the only type made, was introduced in March 1918 with just 20 being produced during the war. The first tank versus tank action took place on the 24th of April 1918 at the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, France, when 3 British Mark IVs met 3 German A7Vs. Captured British Mk4s formed the bulk of Germany's tank forces during World War I. About 35 were in service at any one time. Plans to expand the tank program were underway when the war ended. Other nations. The United States Tank Corps used tanks supplied by France and Great Britain during World War I. Production of American-built tanks had just begun when the war came to an end. Italy also manufactured 2 Fiat 2000s towards the end of the war, too late to see service. Russia independently built and trialed 2 prototypes early in the war, the tracked, 2-man Vezdekhoved and the huge Lebedenko, but neither went into production. A tracked self-propelled gun was also designed but not produced. Although tank tactics developed rapidly during the war, Piecemeal deployments, mechanical problems, and poor mobility limited the military significance of the tank in World War I, and the tank did not fulfill its promise of rendering trench warfare obsolete. Nonetheless, it was clear to military thinkers on both sides that tanks in some way could have a significant role in future conflicts. Interwar period. Main article, Tanks of the interwar period. In the interwar period, tanks underwent further mechanical development. In terms of tactics, J.F.C. Fuller's doctrine of spear